On an October morning in 1847, with the maple leaves burning red along the ridgeline and a cold wind sweeping down from the north, Caleb Dunmore stood in the dooryard of his family's farmhouse outside Boone, North Carolina, and listened to his father tell him he was no longer welcome. It wasn't done with cruelty, exactly. Harlan Dunmore was not a cruel man, just a tired one, with a farm that couldn't feed 7 mouths, and a wife who had opinions about which mouths mattered most. Caleb was the youngest of 4 sons. The eldest, Thomas, had already taken over the best 30 acres. The middle 2, James and Robert, had married well and built houses on adjoining land their wives' families had provided. Caleb had done none of these things. Caleb read books. "There's nothing here for you, boy," Harlan said, not meeting his son's eyes. He pressed a leather pouch into Caleb's hand. $4.60, the sum total of a youngest son's inheritance. "Your mother thinks you'd do well in Asheville. They need clerks." Behind the window glass, Caleb could see his mother's face, tight and expressionless. Beside her stood Thomas's wife, Lucille, who had been campaigning for Caleb's removal since the day she'd arrived as a bride and found him reading Emerson at the kitchen table instead of mucking the pig stall. Caleb looked at the money in his hand. He looked at the hills rising beyond the farm, the ancient folds of the Blue Ridge running south and west, their slopes cloaked in a forest so dense and dark it seemed to swallow sound itself. "I don't think I'll go to Asheville," he said quietly. His father blinked. "Then where?" Caleb nodded toward the mountains. "Up." Thomas, leaning against the fence rail with his arms crossed, let out a bark of laughter. "Up where? There's nothing up there but rock and laurel thicket. You'll be back inside a week begging for table scraps." Caleb picked up the canvas sack he'd packed that morning. 2 shirts, a wool blanket, his dead grandfather's hand axe, a copy of Virgil's Georgics in translation, and a pouch of dried corn. He slung it over his shoulder. "Maybe," he said. And he walked toward the tree line without looking back. He climbed for 2 days. The trails, such as they were, had been cut by deer and black bear. Caleb followed them upward through dense stands of tulip poplar and white oak, through laurel hells so thick he had to crawl on hands and knees over granite outcroppings slick with moss and runoff from recent rains. His boots, already worn thin, split along the sole on the second afternoon. He wrapped them with strips torn from one of his shirts and kept climbing. On the evening of the second day, at an elevation he guessed was near 4,000 feet, he found the cliff. It was a massive exposure of gneiss rock, dark gray and streaked with bands of quartz and feldspar, rising nearly vertical for 60 feet above a narrow shelf of relatively flat ground. The shelf itself was perhaps 2 acres, tucked into a natural alcove in the mountainside where the cliff curved inward like a cupped hand. Below, the slope fell away steeply into a hollow choked with hemlock and rhododendron. Above, the cliff face leaned slightly outward, creating a natural overhang that sheltered the back portion of the shelf from rain. But it was what grew on that shelf that stopped Caleb in his tracks. Soil had accumulated in the alcove over centuries, washed down from above, trapped by the curve of the cliff, enriched by the slow decomposition of countless seasons of fallen leaves. The ground was dark, almost black, and from it grew a riot of plants: wild ginger, bloodroot, trillium, and Caleb knelt and pushed aside a mat of dead leaves. Ramps. Acres of wild ramps, their broad green leaves unmistakable even in autumn's decline. He pressed his fingers into the soil. It was deep, far deeper than he'd expected on a mountainside. He dug with his hand, then with a stick, and at 14 inches he still hadn't hit rock. The cliff, acting as a catchment over millennia, had built a pocket of topsoil richer than anything on his father's farm below. That night, he slept under the overhang with his back against the cliff face, wrapped in his blanket. The stone was warm, not the faint residual warmth of a rock that had sat in afternoon sun. This was different, steady, deep, the kind of warmth that radiated from the interior of the earth itself. Caleb pressed both palms flat against the rock and held them there for a long time, feeling the heat seep into his bones. "All right," he said to no one. "I'll stay." The first weeks were brutal and methodical. He had no saw, no hammer, no nails. What he had was his grandfather's hand axe, a fine piece of forged steel with a hickory handle, and the willingness to use it from first light until his arms shook. He felled small hemlocks and stripped their branches, notching the logs at the ends in the simplest fashion he could manage. The shelter he built against the cliff face was crude. A single room, 8 feet by 10, with the warm cliff wall forming the back and one side. The roof was hemlock boughs layered thick over a frame of poles, angled to shed rain toward the downhill side. It leaked. Everything leaked that first November, but the cliff wall radiated its gentle, constant warmth. He estimated it at perhaps 55 degrees, even as the outside air dropped below freezing. And that warmth turned his rough shelter into something survivable. He learned the mountain the way a scholar learns a text, slowly, attentively, returning to the same passages again and again. He discovered that a spring emerged from a fissure in the cliff face 40 yards to the east, running clear and cold year-round. He found that the southern exposure of his shelf caught sunlight from mid-morning to late afternoon, even in December, when the sun tracked low across the sky. He noted which plants grew where, which birds called from which trees, where the deer bedded down in the rhododendron thickets below. He began to clear his shelf of brush, working in careful sections. The soil, when he turned it with a sharpened stick, was extraordinary, dark, friable, webbed with the roots of centuries. He composted everything: food scraps, leaf litter, the entrails of the rabbits and squirrels he snared. By December, he had cleared a 1/4-acre plot and mounded it into rough raised beds, ready for spring planting. The town of Boone was a 7-mile walk down the mountain. Caleb made the trip once in late November to buy seed: turnip, cabbage, potato, and bean, spending nearly $1 of his dwindling money. The clerk at the general store, a man named Fredericks, asked where he was farming. "Up on the cliff shelf, above Watauga Hollow," Caleb said. Fredericks stared at him. "Ain't nothing up there but rock." "There's soil," Caleb said. "Good soil." The story spread through Boone the way stories do in small towns, quickly and with embellishment. By Christmas, Caleb Dunmore was known as the fool who thought he could farm a cliff. His brother Thomas reportedly laughed so hard at the idea he spilled his cider. Someone began calling Caleb the Cliff Crow, a reference to his dark hair and the supposedly bird-brained nature of his enterprise. Caleb heard the name when he came to town for salt in January. He bought his salt and walked back up the mountain without comment. The winter of 1847 to 48 was harsh even by mountain standards. Snow lay 3 feet deep on the shelf by February, and temperatures plunged to 10 below zero on the coldest nights. Caleb survived because of the cliff. He had by then figured out what his grandfather's old almanac could not have told him. The rock face was warmed from within by the earth's own heat. The gneiss, dense and ancient, conducted warmth from deep underground to its surface at a steady rate. On the coldest nights, When the air outside his shelter was brutal enough to kill, the cliff wall behind him maintained its patient 55 degrees. He built his fire small, just enough to cook and to warm the air near the entrance, and let the cliff do the rest. He also discovered, through careful observation and much trial, the principle of thermal mass in his construction. The stones he stacked along the base of his walls absorbed heat during the day when sunlight struck the shelf, then released it slowly through the night. By late January, he had rebuilt the lower portions of his shelter walls with dry stacked stone 2 feet thick, and the difference was remarkable. Even without a fire, the interior held at 40 degrees or better. He recorded all of this in a journal, a small leather-bound book he'd bought in Boone for 15 cents. His entries were precise and methodical. Temperatures measured by a simple spirit thermometer, another 20-cent investment, weather conditions, soil observations, notes on which wild plants emerged first as winter began to relent. Spring arrived in late March with a suddenness that startled him. 1 week the shelf was buried in snow. The next, water was running everywhere, and the first green shoots of ramps were pushing through the dark soil. Caleb planted his seeds in April, working them into the beds he'd prepared the previous autumn. The results astonished him. The combination of deep, rich soil, southern exposure, the cliff's thermal radiation, and the natural windbreak created a microclimate unlike anything in the valley below. His turnips were up in 6 days. His cabbage seedlings grew so vigorously he had to thin them twice. The potatoes, planted in the darkest, deepest soil near the base of the cliff, produced tubers of a size that would have been remarkable on the best bottomland farm in Watauga County. By June, Caleb Dunmore had more food than he could eat. He carried the surplus down to Boone and sold it, not at the general store, where Fredericks would have marked it up and given him pennies, but directly to housewives at the weekly market. His produce was visibly superior, larger, denser, more flavorful than what the valley farms were yielding. The women noticed. They began to ask for him by name. The Cliff Crow's cabbages, they called them, and now the nickname carried a different weight. In September of 1848, a man named Dr. Elias Whitfield passed through Boone on a botanical survey for the state of North Carolina. He was a professor of natural sciences at the university in Chapel Hill, lean and precise in his manner, with a particular interest in Appalachian soil composition and plant distribution. Someone at the boarding house, perhaps meaning it as a joke, told him about the young man farming a cliff. Whitfield climbed the mountain the next morning. Caleb was splitting firewood when the professor emerged from the tree line, breathing hard and red-faced from the ascent. He looked at the shelf, the neat rows of late-season beans, the potato mounds, the sturdy log and stone shelter with its clever use of the cliff overhang, and he did not laugh. He stood very still for a long time, examining everything with the careful eye of a man trained to observe. "Who taught you to do this?" he asked. "Nobody," Caleb said. "The mountain taught me, I suppose." Whitfield spent 3 days on the shelf. He tested the soil and found it remarkably high in organic matter and mineral content. The centuries of leaf decomposition combined with mineral-rich runoff from the cliff face had created what he called, in his later published report, a natural raised garden of exceptional fertility. He measured the cliff face temperature and confirmed Caleb's observations about the geothermal warmth. He studied the microclimate and declared the shelf a natural hothouse, protected from the worst winds and frosts by the curvature of the cliff while receiving maximum solar exposure. Before he left, Whitfield told Caleb something that changed the trajectory of his life. "You're not just farming," the professor said, packing his specimen jars carefully into his leather case. "You're demonstrating principles that most agricultural minds in this country haven't even theorized yet. Thermal mass cultivation, microclimate management. If you keep records, detailed records, what you're building here could matter to people far beyond this mountain." He left Caleb with two gifts: a copy of Justus von Liebig's Chemistry in its application to agriculture, recently translated from the German, and a standing invitation to correspond. Caleb read the Liebig book twice through before the first snow of that second winter. It gave him language for what he'd already been observing: the chemistry of soil fertility, the role of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, the principles of nutrient cycling that his composting had been accomplishing by instinct. He began to experiment with purpose. He terraced the shelf, building low walls of dry stacked stone to create level planting beds at different heights along the slight natural slope. Each terrace caught and held moisture differently. Each received a slightly different angle of sunlight. Each sat at a different distance from the warming cliff face. He planted different crops at each level and kept meticulous records of their growth rates, yields, and flavor. He discovered that root vegetables planted closest to the cliff, within 3 feet of the warm stone, could be left in the ground well into December without freezing. He found that by building a simple cold frame from flat stones and a sheet of oiled paper, he could extend his growing season by nearly 2 months in either direction. By 1850, he was harvesting fresh greens in March and pulling the last carrots from the ground in January, a growing season that dwarfed anything possible in the valley below. The town's laughter had faded by then, replaced by something closer to bewildered respect. Caleb's produce had become a fixture at the Boone market. His potatoes won informal contests. His cabbages were sought after for sauerkraut. He was earning, by his own careful accounting, nearly $80 a year from his cliff farm, more than many valley operations twice its size. It was at the Boone market in the spring of 1851 that he met Ada. Ada Renner was 24 years old, the daughter of a German immigrant stonemason who had settled in the Watauga Valley in the 1830s. Her mother had died when she was 12, and she had run her father's household ever since, cooking, keeping accounts, and, in the quiet hours, reading every book she could borrow or buy. She spoke English and German fluently and had taught herself enough Latin to read botanical texts in the original. She came to Caleb's market stall because she'd heard his cabbages were good for fermenting. She stayed because she noticed the copy of Liebig's Chemistry wedged between the potato baskets. "You read Liebig?" she asked, picking up the book and examining it with the casual familiarity of someone who recognized it. "Twice," Caleb said. "Though I think his theory of mineral nutrition is incomplete. He doesn't account for what living soil organisms contribute." Ada looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. This thin, quiet man with calloused hands and soil under his fingernails who was casually critiquing one of Europe's foremost chemists. "My father has Sprengel's original papers," she said, "on the nutrient theory, in German. I could translate the relevant sections for you." "I would be grateful for that," Caleb said. What followed was a courtship conducted almost entirely through agricultural science. Ada visited the cliff shelf in May, climbing the mountain path with the same determined practicality she brought to everything. She examined Caleb's terraces, his cold frames, his composting system, and his journals with the thoroughness of a fellow researcher. She pointed out that his lower terraces would benefit from the addition of lime to counteract the natural acidity of the mountain soil. She was right. They married in October of 1851, in a small ceremony in Boone that neither Caleb's mother nor his brothers attended. Ada's father, a broad-shouldered man named Carl, who had built half the stone chimneys in the county, gave his blessing with a handshake and a wedding gift of stonemason's tools. Those tools transformed the cliff shelf. With Carl's chisels and Ada's understanding of her father's craft, they began to reshape the shelter into a true home. They squared the walls with properly dressed stone. They built a chimney that drew perfectly, using the natural updraft created by the cliff overhang. They laid a stone floor with channels cut into it that directed warmth from the cliff face upward through the living space. Carl himself came up the mountain twice to advise on the chimney construction, each time shaking his head in admiration at the cliff's natural warmth. In the old country, he told Caleb, they would have built a castle here. By the spring of 1852, the Dunmore Cliff home was a structure of genuine comfort and ingenuity. 2 rooms, stone-walled and tight, with the great warm cliff forming the entire back wall. A root cellar dug into the base of the cliff where the temperature never varied from 53 degrees. A spring house built over the Fisher Spring, keeping milk and butter cool in summer and unfrozen in winter. Their first child, a son they named Harlan after Caleb's father, in a gesture of forgiveness that was never acknowledged, was born in that house in August of 1852. The famine year came in 1854. It was not a single event, but a cascade of misfortunes that had been building since 1852. A late frost in May of 1853 had damaged crops across the mountain counties. A summer drought followed, stunting what survived. Then, in the spring of 1854, a blight swept through the potato fields of western North Carolina. Not the same organism that had devastated Ireland a decade earlier, but a fungal rot that turned tubers black and foul in the ground. Valley farms lost 70 to 90% of their potato crop. Corn withered. Bean harvests fell to a fraction of normal. By August of 1854, families in Watauga County were going hungry. Caleb's cliff farm was not untouched. The drought had reduced his yields, and the blight found some of his lower terrace potatoes. But the damage was a fraction of what the valley suffered. The thermal mass of the cliff had moderated the late frost. The deep, rich soil retained moisture far longer than the thin valley topsoil, and the potatoes planted closest to the cliff wall in the warmest soil had resisted the blight almost entirely. His journals recorded the observation precisely. The fungus appeared to require cooler soil temperatures to establish itself, and the near cliff beds never dropped below the threshold. He harvested nearly 800 pounds of potatoes that autumn. In a county where families were boiling tree bark for soup, 800 pounds of potatoes was not a surplus. It was salvation. Caleb loaded a mule, bought the previous year with market earnings, and carried 200 pounds of potatoes down to Boone. He did not sell them. He gave them away, distributing them from the back of the general store to anyone who came with an empty sack. Among those who came, thin-faced and silent, was Thomas Dunmore. The brothers had not spoken in 7 years. Thomas's farm, the best 30 acres their father had owned, had been devastated. The frost had taken his apple trees. The drought had withered his corn. The blight had destroyed his potatoes entirely. His wife, Lucille, who had once maneuvered to have Caleb sent away, stood behind him with their 3 children, all of them gaunt. Caleb filled their sacks without a word. Thomas opened his mouth as if to speak, to thank him perhaps or to apologize, but nothing came out. He nodded once and walked away. Caleb made 5 more trips down the mountain that autumn and into the winter, carrying everything he could spare. Ada, who was pregnant with their second child, managed the cliff farm in his absence with the competence that characterized everything she did. By spring, the Dunmore cliff shelf had fed not only its own family, but had contributed meaningfully to the survival of a dozen others. No one in Boone called him the Cliff Crow anymore. The years that followed were ones of steady building, not dramatic, but deep. Caleb expanded his terraces, eventually cultivating nearly the entire 2-acre shelf. He developed a system of stone-lined channels that distributed water from the cliff spring to every terrace, a gravity-fed irrigation network that required no pumping and no maintenance beyond occasional clearing of leaf debris. He experimented with crop rotation patterns informed by Liebig's chemistry and his own observations, developing a 4-year cycle that maintained soil fertility without external fertilizers. He corresponded regularly with Dr. Whitfield, who published a second paper in 1856, citing Caleb's records extensively. The paper attracted attention from agricultural reformers in Raleigh and beyond. Visitors began to make the climb. Professors, farmers, journalists, and once, in 1860, a photographer from Harper's Weekly who cursed the entire 7-mile ascent, but produced a remarkable image of the terraced cliff farm that was published under the title The Garden in the Sky. Ada bore 4 children in all: Harlan, then Clara in 1854, then twin boys, Carl and Elias, in 1857. The children grew up on the cliff shelf, like mountain goats, sure-footed and curious, educated by their mother from books and by their father from the living text of the mountain. Harlan developed his father's gift for observation and his mother's facility with languages. Clara showed an early talent for drawing that she would eventually apply to botanical illustration. The twins were builders, like their maternal grandfather, forever stacking stones and engineering small dams in the spring runoff. The Civil War passed over them like a distant storm. Caleb was too old for conscription by the time it reached its hungriest years, and the cliff shelf was too remote and too poor-seeming to attract the foraging parties that stripped the valley farms. They endured, as they had always endured, by being close to the mountain. Thomas Dunmore was not so fortunate. He had mortgaged his land to survive the famine years and never recovered. By 1865, the family farm, the good 30 acres that had once seemed the only inheritance worth having, belonged to a bank in Charlotte. Thomas moved his family to Tennessee. Caleb heard about it secondhand and said nothing, though Ada noticed he was quiet for several days afterward. In 1871, at the age of 44, Caleb began to teach. It started informally, farmers from the valley climbing up to ask advice about soil management or frost protection. Caleb, who had spent 24 years refining his techniques, found that he enjoyed explaining what he'd learned. He had a teacher's gift for making complex principles visible through simple demonstration. He would take a visitor to 2 adjacent terraces, one limed and one not, and let them see the difference in the bean plants with their own eyes. He would press their hands against the cliff face and ask them to feel what the earth was offering. Word spread. By 1875, Caleb was hosting what he called mountain classes, week-long sessions in which small groups of farmers lived on the cliff shelf and learned his methods of terracing, composting, thermal mass cultivation, and water management. He charged nothing. Ada fed them all from the cliff farm's produce and kept detailed notes on what was taught and what questions were asked. Dr. Whitfield, now elderly and retired, made one final visit in 1878. He sat on the stone bench Caleb had built at the edge of the shelf, overlooking the vast green tumble of the Blue Ridge, and he shook his head slowly. "You've done something here that no university could have done," he said. "You've proved it with 30 years of living." Caleb, gray-haired now but still lean and strong from decades of mountain work, sat beside him. "I didn't prove anything," he said. "The mountain proved it. I just paid attention." Caleb Dunmore died on a March morning in 1893, at the age of 66. He had been declining since the previous autumn, a cough that deepened into something that rattled in his chest, a weariness that even the cliff's warmth couldn't ease. Ada, who knew herbs and remedies as well as she knew soil chemistry, did what she could. The children came home. Harlan from the agricultural college in Raleigh, where he taught soil science. Clara from her studio in Asheville, where her botanical prints sold to collectors. The twins from their stonework business in Boone. On his last morning, Caleb asked to be carried outside. They set him in a chair on the shelf, wrapped in blankets, facing south where the late winter sun was just clearing the ridge. The air was cold, but the cliff at his back was warm, as it had always been warm, as it would be warm long after he was gone. His grandchildren, 7 of them by then, gathered around him. The youngest, Thomas's boy, who was 5 and had been named Caleb, climbed into his lap. "There's always more," the old man said, his voice thin but clear. "More in the soil, more in the rock, more in each other. Don't stop looking." He died that afternoon with his hand resting on the cliff face, as if drawing warmth from it one last time. Ada survived him by 11 years, maintaining the cliff farm with the help of the twins until her own death in 1904. Harlan Dunmore went on to establish one of the first soil science programs in the American South, citing his father's journals, by then comprising 38 volumes, as foundational texts. Clara's illustrations of Appalachian flora were published in a volume that remained in print for decades. The twins built homes and public buildings across western North Carolina, all of them incorporating the thermal mass principles their father had discovered by pressing his back against a warm cliff on a cold October night. The cliff shelf itself still exists. The terraces have softened under a century of leaf fall, but remain visible, their stone walls holding the mountain's gift of soil in place. The spring still runs from the fissure in the rock. The cliff face, on a winter evening, is still warm to the touch. In 2003, a team of geologists from Appalachian State University, located in Boone, 7 miles below, surveyed the site as part of a study on geothermal gradients in the southern Appalachians. They confirmed what Caleb Dunmore had felt with his bare hands in 1847, a localized thermal anomaly, likely caused by a deep fracture in the bedrock that allowed heat from the Earth's interior to migrate upward through the gneiss. The cliff face maintains a year-round surface temperature of approximately 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Exactly what Caleb had recorded in his journals a century and a half earlier. The lead geologist, reading Caleb's careful temperature logs, reportedly said, "This man was doing geothermal science before the field existed." But Caleb Dunmore had not been trying to advance science. He had been trying to survive. And in surviving, he had done what the mountain had always done. Built something lasting from the slow, patient work of ordinary days, warmed from within by a heat that never failed. The cliff still breathes its warmth into the Carolina night. The soil is still dark and deep, and if you press your hand against the rock, you can feel it. Steady, ancient, generous. The same warmth that once kept a young man alive when the world had no other place for him.